And thanks for all coming to enjoy a cup of NHS tea and coffee this evening. I hope I can give you a little bit of entertainment to go along with that. It's a great privilege for me to have this opportunity to speak to you. As a paediatrician, it's a particular privilege to speak to grown-ups. So thank you very much for coming to listen to me. So I thought I'd talk about vaccines. There's some discrepancy in the titles. The title that I think many of you have had is Swine Flu and Vaccines. And the topic I was asked to speak about was childhood immunisation. So I'm trying to mix a bit of those two together, so hopefully I can meet the objectives that all those of you who have come have for this. And I thought I'd start off by just trying to set the scene about vaccines. And this is actually some data from Canada, looking at the causes of death in childhood. I'm just wondering whether one of these is going to be a pointer, but maybe it isn't. Have we got a pointer? Probably not, so I'll point anyway, since I'm standing here. So these are the causes of death in childhood in Canada. It would be pretty similar in most developing countries, that the vast majority of deaths in childhood are accidental deaths, car accidents, drowning, those sorts of things. And there are a number of children who will die from cancers, and that's a major focus of work that the Biomedical Research Centre here does for that reason. There will be some children who die in yellow here from diseases that they have had since before birth. And then in North America there's a big red bit in teenage, which is homicide, which is not a major problem in Europe, but it really figures on the graphs in North America. And interestingly, when you think about things that you might prevent with vaccines, infectious diseases, they don't really figure very much on this graph. And that might make you question why I'm standing here talking to you today about vaccines at all, since they're probably not very important in preventing death in children, at least in developed countries. But if you contrast that with the global perspective on infectious diseases, which many of which can be prevented by vaccines, you can see that if you take children under 4 years of age, around 2/3 of the deaths in that age group are caused by infections, and many of those infections could be prevented by vaccines. In fact, if you look at what those leading causes of infectious death are, and we just focus on the yellow bars, so which are the children under 5 rather than the total, which includes adults as well. Respiratory infections here is the most common cause of death in that age group, and particularly pneumonia as a cause of death. Number 2 is diarrhea. So gastroenteritis, and then somewhere around number 3 is malaria and measles, and we'll come back to measles particularly a little bit later on. So those are some of the infectious causes of death, and I've just listed here some of the numbers of deaths in the bottom left hand corner there that there are from diseases which can be prevented by vaccines today if we were immunising all of those children. So the difference between what I've given you in the global perspective, with 2/3 of the world's children who dying from infections, and countries like ours, is that we've, just in the last 100 years, had a 100-fold reduction in child mortality. And that is a mixture of various different. We don't live in such crowded and squalid conditions. We're all much better nourished than we were 100 years ago. We're educated, so we avoid diseases in our behaviours. Vaccination also plays an important part in that, and I've discussed some of the roles that it plays as we go through. Now, I am director of the Oxford Vaccine Centre, which is part of the Jenner Institute, and the Jenner Institute really in Oxford comprises these two buildings. There's this top one, which is the Centre for Clinical Vaccinology and Tropical Medicine. We share our home there with the Tropical Medicine group in Oxford. And also this green building here, which is the laboratory area, which there's a lot of study of vaccines. And there's a whole series of investigators involved in the vaccines theme in the Biomedical Research Centre, which supports this programme, that are involved in very important vaccines which will prevent important diseases that we can't yet prevent in childhood and for adults around the world. And with a particular focus on some of the very important diseases in the tropics, such as TB, HIV and malaria. So I'm going to talk a little bit about smallpox to start with. And you noticed on my last slide, I mentioned the Jenner Institute, which is a grouping of all those of us who work on vaccines in Oxford and at the Institute of Animal Health, because of course animals suffer from many diseases that can be prevented by vaccination. And we're unusual in that we work very closely with vets in the development of new vaccines to learn from the technologies they're developing, as well as for them learning from the technologies we're developing. And that's where I start with smallpox. And I start here at 1157 BC. And we know that this Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses V, almost certainly died of smallpox. He only reigned for 5 years. And when his mummified body was examined, and I can't see it on there, but his face and his neck and his chest were covered in smallpox pox marks. And it's thought that he probably, at least suffered from and probably died from smallpox. And this disease was a major problem throughout history. You can find where it's affected important people in this country. It changed the course of history by killing the heir to the throne, Prince William, when he was 11. And there were many famous people who were affected by it, and in the Elizabethan times people wore beauty spots which were to cover up the pox marks that smallpox had made. In the 18th century it was estimated that just in Europe nearly 500,000 people died every year from this disease. And in the 1950s the WHO did an estimate of the global burden of smallpox and thought that about 50 million people were dying every year from smallpox. By 1967, through vaccination, there'd been a big reduction in developed countries, and we were down to about 15 million cases and a few million deaths at that point. Now, wind back the clock a couple of hundred years to Edward Jenner here, who developed a process, the first process of vaccination, by taking a related virus that caused a disease in cows and inoculating, he initially inoculated Phipps, who was a small boy who he then challenged with smallpox, and Phipps famously survived. That program people tried over many times over at least the last 100 years to introduce eradication programs, but they were all done in small areas. And it wasn't until the 1960s that there was a big global program took place, which led to the last case of disease in Somalia in October of 1977. So this disease, smallpox, was eradicated by the late 1970s through vaccination, and many, many cases were prevented in those who were vaccinated in the 200 years before that. There was one accident in the laboratory a year later where a medical photographer developed smallpox, obviously involved in the laboratory, taking some photographs, and acquired the disease. And then the second death, with the professor who was head of that laboratory, then committed suicide after that accident. And interestingly, even as recently as 2004 in New Mexico, there was a discovery in a book about medicine in the Civil War, that there was an envelope containing scabs from smallpox, and that was discovered, and it created a panic in New Mexico that there might be release of the virus again. And of course, most people who are under about 45 or 50 have not ever been vaccinated against smallpox.
How long, if they were newer, how long would they still be alive?
I don't know the answer to that. Almost certainly they would be, but I don't know for certain whether they were able to cultivate it from that. They certainly could get the genes from it. Now here was a cartoon, and so it was. This is just a few years after Edward Jenner wrote his thesis about smallpox. And this is a cartoon from James Gilray, who was a member of the Anti-Vaccine Society in 1802, and was a very brilliant cartoonist. If you ever want to look at some great cartoons from that period, he drew very many. And here he has people who have been vaccinated in the Jenner method, with heads of cows growing out of their arms and developing horns. And that really put a lot of people off being immunised against smallpox at that time. Now, over the last 200 years, in fact mostly the last 120 years or so, there's been a huge amount of effort to try and use these processes to prevent serious diseases in human populations. And this is just a list of some of the vaccines that have been developed over that period. Now, of course, developing a vaccine isn't enough. You actually have to implement them and give them to the population as well if you want to prevent a disease. And this is a history in this country of when some of these very important vaccines were introduced. And in some ways it's quite surprising when we think of the amazing health that we have currently, that many of these have only been around for the last 40 or 50 years. In fact, the programs have really only been here in a large scale since the 1960s. So tetanus only became a national programme in 1961, even though the vaccine had been developed about 30 or 40 years before that. And many of the new vaccines are relatively recently employed to protect against serious diseases. And this is actually what it looks like now. So this is what we do to prevent serious infections in children. This is the childhood programme in the UK today. And each one of those boxes, which has a different colour, represents a different needle. So that's the number of needles, if you counted up all the different coloured boxes, that a child has for their immunisations by the time they leave school. And now some of those combine many different vaccines that prevent diseases in one. So you can see here that this vaccine protects against diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, polio, and a type of meningitis called Hib. And that's just one needle to protect against all of those. But some of the others have to be in separate needles. This is the MMR vaccines preventing measles, mumps, and rubella. So that's 3 in one immunisation. So there's an awful lot of needles, and so one big problem for the programme is persuading parents that it's a good idea to stick a needle in their child this many times. And it's, as you'll hear as we go along, it can be quite hard to persuade them. I thought I'd just touch on a couple of the diseases that we just don't see now, and the reason why we don't see them is simply because of the immunisation programme. This is a painting by Goya of a child who had diphtheria and later died from the disease, and it's hard to imagine Goya sitting there painting this with this child. This child would have had a swollen neck, and the reason why the child died is if you looked in the back of the throat, there would be a membrane covering the back of the throat which would have actually killed the child by asphyxia. So they wouldn't have been able to breathe. And diphtheria vaccine was introduced in this country in 1940, and we had tens of thousands of cases, mostly affecting children each year during that period. And after the vaccine was introduced, that disease just disappeared. So that today we don't see any cases at all in childhood because of the vaccine. And the only cases we see are in the very later years of age, people who weren't vaccinated in the programme or missed the programme. And they're people who have travelled to countries which have a lot of diphtheria, particularly Russia, and then come back and actually develop the disease when they're back in this country or when they're travelling. And those are people who are never vaccinated. But everyone who's been vaccinated seems to be protected, and we don't see spread of diphtheria anymore here. And in fact, even in this period, there are only 2 deaths from 1986 to 2002, and those weren't in children. Another disease that we just don't see here, except in very old age, is tetanus. And again, this is because nearly everyone in the UK is vaccinated against tetanus. And this is a horrible disease which is caused by infection by bacteria in wounds. And the bacteria release a toxin which causes spasm in muscles. And usually people who die from this disease die because they can't breathe because of the spasm in their muscles. And I've seen many children in developing countries and adults with this disease. And there's really in childhood, 2 main populations who get tetanus. The first are babies because of poor hygiene around childbirth, and they develop tetanus very early on. That's called neonatal tetanus. And the next group is young adolescent males who are going out and doing dangerous things and falling out of trees and damaging their limbs because this bacterium is everywhere in the soil. It's in the soil here in Oxford. And you can go and acquire it through any wound that you have that's cut. So if we're not immunised, you can get disease from tetanus. And so that's this disease. When tetanus was common in this country, somewhere between 1 and 9 out of every 10 people who got it died. And in most developing countries, nearly everyone dies who gets it because the only way to survive is to have very good intensive care to support the breathing until you get over the disease and obviously get rid of the infection. And at the moment, as I said, there are no cases or deaths in children under 5 years because of the immunisation programme. If you interrupt that, immediately children who are not immunised will acquire the disease again because it's there in the soil. And here you can see this is in the period from 1984 to 2003, just looking at the cases, and all of the cases are in older age groups who were never vaccinated. Another very important disease that we immunise against is whooping cough, and any of us can get whooping cough, but those who suffer from it are very young babies, usually in the first 2 to 6 months of life. And this is a child with whooping cough. In the 1950s, before we had whooping cough vaccine, There are around about 120,000 cases every year of this disease, and about 1 in 500 babies with the disease would die. And our immunisation programme starts at 2 months of age, and that's where we give the first dose of the whooping cough vaccine. And it's pretty effective after you've given a few doses of preventing disease. But the most important thing is making sure that none of the siblings of those babies have whooping cough, because we can't give the vaccine at the moment in the first 2 months of life, which is the greatest risk of death. So if we interrupt at all the amount of vaccine that's given in very early childhood, then the siblings of the small babies get whooping cough, and then the babies get it and they will die, or some of them will. The other problem with whooping cough is that the vaccines don't work that well. They work very well for a short term, but they don't give you protection over decades. And what we've discovered really in the last 15 or 20 years is that many adults who have a chronic cough that lasts for 3 weeks or more turn out to have whooping cough. And that's even though they were vaccinated in childhood, they have the disease. And of the children I've seen in this country who have had severe whooping cough, all of them have got it from their mother, even though that mother was fully vaccinated in childhood. And so we have an ongoing problem of trying to evaluate how we can do better to reduce the case of disease. The numbers of cases are very low at the moment, but there is still some transmission. I've seen several babies with severe disease in Oxford, and some of those have died over the last decade. Another disease which has really disappeared from the public eye is polio. And I see many of you are of an age where you'll recognise this condition either from friends of yours or from other people that you knew when you were growing up, from these very typical pictures of the disease. And polio is a viral infection which causes paralysis in a proportion of those who get the disease. During the epidemics in the 1950s, there were about 8,000 cases of paralysis, and 1 in 1,000 of those of those who developed the disease were affected by it. Some of those who got into hospital died because we weren't very good at supporting the breathing in those people who were paralysed in those days. We're much better at doing that now, but it was the permanent paralysis, which was the image that many of us still hold. But if you go and talk to teenagers now, they have no image at all of what polio looks like. And so the vaccine, which is a needle that you stick into a baby, seems a pretty nasty thing to do for a disease that you've never seen or heard of or believe exists. And in fact, the disease has been eradicated from Europe, at least for now. I want to just very briefly mention a couple of the viruses which we prevent diseases by. Mumps. Not a terribly severe illness. Many of you will have had mumps in childhood. I had mumps as a child. And at the time, before the vaccine was introduced, there were about 1,200 admissions each year. The problem with mumps was that it was the most frequent cause of viral meningitis in children, which wasn't too serious. It made them quite unwell, but most survived. But then it was the commonest cause of acquired deafness. So many of the people who became deaf after early childhood in that time were deaf because of this virus. And it was very easy to add mumps into the MMR vaccine to provide the possibility of preventing all that acquired deafness that was occurring in children. We still do have some cases of mumps at the moment, but it's thought that will be more or less completely eradicated over the next years, as long as immunisation continues. Rubella or German measles is another of the viruses which we can protect against in the German measles, in the MMR vaccine, rubella or German measles. And it is not a very serious disease. It was a common childhood disease. Again, many of you in childhood will have had rubella. The problem with it was if you got infected when you were pregnant, because it was terribly damaging to the developing baby inside the mother. And these are some children who had the disease. This is a baby who developed cataracts and was blind from that at birth. Children who have severe mental retardation and deafness and so on. So it can really damage babies when they're growing in the womb. We have very few cases now as a result of the very good coverage that there had been with the MMR vaccine, with only 14 cases confirmed in 2004 and only 1 infection in pregnancy in 2003. And I don't think we've had a rubella-affected baby for about 15 years now. So we're doing extremely well at preventing this awful disease in very young children. So to come on to measles, which is the perhaps the most important component of the MMR vaccine, and in my view one of the most important diseases that we protect against with immunisation. This is the image of measles that I think of when I think of measles. This is the sort of child I've seen in working in developing countries, occasional cases in this country, with this severe disease and very high mortality of those that we see in the hospital setting. The problem with measles is that this is the image of measles that many parents have, because of course it's a disease which is incredibly infectious and infects everyone. And the numbers who get this severe disease are relatively small in a developed country. And if that's your image of measles, you wouldn't worry about it. And if there was any risk at all of a vaccine, you wouldn't be vaccinated against with it. But the problem is this severe disease that affects some children and very commonly causes terrible disease in those children who are immunocompromised because of their treatment for cancer or because they have HIV or something like that. If you look back to the 1960s, before we used any measles vaccine, there were somewhere between 160,000 and 1 million cases a year. So it was a very common disease in this country. And somewhere around 1 in 2,500 of those children died. And that contrasts with my experiences in developing countries where somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 200 children with the disease will die. And it's thought the very high mortality in that setting is because of their poor nutritional status and because they have a burden of other diseases as well. About 1 in 1,000 children in this country used to get quite a severe brain inflammation as part of the disease, which could cause some brain damage. And some children would develop a very unusual condition called SSPE, where they have their measles infection and then many years later develop a fatal condition where the measles virus is still in the brain and causes some damage. When the measles vaccine was introduced, this disease almost entirely vanished from the UK. As you can see, the measles vaccine on its own was introduced in the 1960s. MMR vaccine was introduced in 1988, and some of the children who hadn't been vaccinated were caught in a catch-up campaign in the early 90s. And we then went through a wonderful period during the 1990s where there were no cases, and most paediatricians who were training at the time never saw measles. They never saw a case of measles. And that all changed over this decade with an increase in cases. And you can see here that this is around the time that there was the scare about MMR vaccine and autism in the early 2000s, end of the 90s. And we started to see little outbreaks of cases, and we're now in the middle of a developing epidemic of measles. Over this period, before here, we hadn't seen any deaths from measles for, I think, 10 or 12 or 15 years, something like that. And in the last 10 years, we've seen 3 or 4 deaths in the UK. And you can predict that there will be people dying from measles again. And everyone's forgotten what an awful disease this is. So the problem is actually the public perception of vaccines. Because we don't have these diseases, many people view the vaccines as the dangerous thing, not the diseases that they're preventing. And written like this, it looks like there's an evenly balanced argument between measles and the vaccine. But actually measles is far worse than any possible side effect of a vaccine. And I'll come to some points about that in a moment. We now know that MMR doesn't cause autism. I guess it's reasonable to throw up a hypothesis and then test it. And the problem with that has been the public effect of that rather than testing a hypothesis and then coming up with an answer, it ended up with many children not being immunised against this important disease. So it doesn't cause autism, but actually around about 1,000 children haven't died from measles in the last 15 years because we've had quite a good immunisation programme. Here, if you look worldwide in 2000, 733,000 children died from measles. A couple of years before, it was just over 1 million. So we had an incredible global burden of deaths from this disease. And there's been a World Health Organization measles campaign to try and stamp out the disease, particularly in the poorer countries in Africa. And by 2009, we'd got that down to 164,000, and there's efforts continue at the moment, and those numbers are dropping year on year. I mean, this has been incredible to drop child deaths by that amount just by immunising against one disease. And that's rolling out particularly in Africa, but also in South Asia, where most of the cases are in those two regions. So here's the dilemma for parents. So this is a child who's pretty grumpy about being put into their car seat, and I'm told from this Department of Transport website that this is the wrong sort of car seat anyway for the child, but anyway, that's not the reason for putting it up. So this child's pretty grumpy about being put in their car seat, but I think we're all pretty comfortable with the idea that they should be locked in like that. Does anyone disagree? Anyone think they shouldn't have had the car seat and the seat belt on? So the problem is that that child could die from injuries caused by the seat belt. But that doesn't make us all want to not put the seatbelt on, because we know how high the risk is of them dying from injuries if they don't have the seatbelt. And the problem for immunisation is that we're going to stick a needle into this child for a disease we've never seen, probably don't even know the name of, or find it hard to visualise or picture what this disease looks like. And actually, the process of sticking a needle into your baby doesn't really feel like the nurturing thing you should be doing to your child. And the disease you don't have any knowledge of. So it's not quite the same as the car crash. You can imagine a car crash. You see stuff on the television about it all the time. And it's quite easy to, despite the small risk of that child being injured by the car seat, you're still going to put the seat belt on. Whereas with immunisation, we don't really have any concept of the weight of evidence that there is about how awful the diseases are, and we're so focused and worried about what that syringe of material might do to damage that child. Now, no vaccines are completely safe, that's absolutely clear, but the risk of any serious injury from them is absolutely minuscule. The main side effects from all of these vaccines is sore arms or legs, temperatures, in small children, occasionally fits associated with a fever. Almost all of those things are completely harmless and self-resolving, compared with that huge burden of disease and death that I've mentioned caused by the diseases. So these are some of the images that there are. This is the iron lung of a child with polio. Another picture of a child with polio. Many of those images are no longer in the public eye at the moment. And I think that means that the audience that the public health experts are speaking to is an audience who's focusing on the safety of the vaccine, not on the risk of the disease, because the disease has disappeared. And of course, we're all much more sophisticated and we know a lot more about what could go wrong than we did in the past. In 2005, there were 141 child deaths in road traffic accidents in the UK. The serious side effect that there is from all vaccines is a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis. And in the past, people died from anaphylaxis. And that's really what those who were giving the immunisations worry about, because it's pretty scary when someone develops this severe allergic reaction. You have to respond to it and treat it. It happens in somewhere around 1 in a million people that you immunise with just about any vaccine. They have an allergic reaction. And in this period, between 1997 and 2003, there were 130 episodes of that severe side effect of vaccines that were recorded. But there were no deaths reported, because we're so well set up now to recognise it and to treat it with adrenaline, which is the treatment for anaphylaxis. So I want to move on now to talk briefly about meningitis, which has been a major focus of my interest in vaccines and research and the time involved with. And it makes headlines. These are some Oxford students in the mid-90s who developed this type of meningitis, and there were several deaths. This was at Brookes University, but there have been some at Oxford University as well, and high profile when personalities are affected. Now, all of the bugs that cause meningitis, and this is one of them, this is called the meningococcus, all of the bugs that cause it have around them a sugar coat. This is the sugar coat around the meningococcus. It's called a polysaccharide, and it's a type of sugar coat. And most of the vaccines that we have that prevent meningitis have been made by taking the sugar coat and using it to make a vaccine which our immune system recognises, so that if we get exposed to the bug again on a later date, we remember that we've already been immunised with the vaccine, with the sugar coat, and therefore we don't get disease. This isn't going to project terribly well, I don't think, but the point of this is to show that there isn't just one bug that causes meningitis in this country. There are these 4 different bugs that I've put on here that cause meningitis, and they all cause very similar disease. If you see a child with it, you wouldn't be able to tell which of those in general it was by how the child looks when they have this infection, which is an infection around the brain and over the surface of the brain. Some children will die from the disease, some will be brain damaged, and the commonest form of brain damage in meningitis is deafness, rather as it was in mumps meningitis I talked about earlier. Now the first, this is actually the second vaccine that we've had that prevents cases of meningitis. This is the Men-C vaccine, or the serogroup C meningococcal vaccine, and that was introduced in '99, and you can see here on the dark blue line, those were cases in children of this form of meningitis that there were up until '99. The vaccine was introduced, and so everyone in this room under 30 has had this vaccine, and then the disease disappeared, and we just don't see this disease at all. Last year there were only 8 cases, whereas here you can see it at a peak on this graph. Well, you can't tell from this graph the way it's drawn, but there were about 1,000 cases a year. We only had 8. So just in 10 years we've dropped by that huge amount. This was the first meningitis vaccine that was introduced, called Hib, and you can see it was introduced back in 1992, and again the disease has almost disappeared. When I spoke with some of our trainees the other day who've been training in paediatrics during this decade, none of them had ever seen a case of this disease because it was eradicated. Not eradicated, there are still a few cases around, but most of the cases disappeared when the vaccine was introduced. And so that leaves us with a bit of a balance between 2 different types, or 5 different types of meningitis. So there's the Hib one, which I've just shown you has almost disappeared. The Men-C one, which for the last 10 years has almost disappeared. There's a pneumococcal one, and the pneumococcal bug is difficult because there isn't just one type. There are about 90 different types, all of which can cause disease. And the vaccine we've had for the last 4 years contains 7 types, and it does prevent meningitis caused by those 7 types. But we're left with many others, and there is a vaccine being developed at the moment which covers another 6 of them. And there's a big problem with another bug called Men-B, which is another type of meningitis, which I'm going to touch on briefly. This slide really makes an announcement, or feeds an announcement too, that was made last week. And if you remember, I said for this pneumococcal bug, we were able to prevent 7 types. In April, there's a new vaccine going to be introduced, which will allow us to prevent 13 types of this type of meningitis. And that's based on studies we did here in Oxford over the last few years. So how successful have these meningitis vaccines been? So I mentioned that Hib was introduced in '92, and we reckon that something like 10,000 cases of disease caused by this bug have been prevented since 1992, just in this country. The Men-C, or meningitis C vaccine, that was introduced in '99, and we think that's prevented about 15,000 cases of this severe disease, meningitis, that SOS students from Brookes University newspaper headline was about. That's been incredibly effective. And the Pneumo 7 one we're less sure about. We think there's probably been about 1,000 cases over the last few years in children under 2, but the programme's a bit too early to have been fully evaluated. So what are the big challenges that are left for meningitis vaccines? Well, I've already mentioned the other types of pneumococcal meningitis and the new vaccine that's coming in April for that. Meningitis B is the major problem for the UK, as I'll show you. And there's another issue, which is sustaining protection. So when you give vaccines, how long do you need to be protected for? How do you maintain that protection in those who you vaccinated? So this is meningococcal disease, and I've talked about the vaccine for C, which is here in red, and you can see there were lots of cases. The vaccine was introduced, and then the disease has almost completely disappeared. And we have a few other types, which I'm not going to talk about today, but most of the meningitis caused by this family of bacteria is group B, or Men-B, and that's all of this component here. So this is just looking at Men-C. So this one where we introduced the vaccine in '99 has almost completely disappeared. And what we did over the last few years is we tried to get a snapshot of what the immunity looks like in children. So how many of the children are actually protected against the disease? And what we found was that if you look at teenagers and young adults up to the age of 30, most are protected. So this dotted line is the levels of protection. Most are protected. If you look at babies who have just been vaccinated down at that end, most of them are protected as well, because they've just had the vaccine. but we didn't have any boosters through the middle bit of childhood. And none of the children, almost none, 10% of them only, are protected in that age group. So we have a problem about sustaining immunity in the population. And to cut a long story short, when this group move to being adolescents and young adults who are the spreaders of this disease, we have a risk of this disease coming back again. We're all right at the moment because everyone in adolescence and young adulthood are protected from the vaccines they've had. But this group here, when they get to that age, are going to be a risk to all the rest of us of the disease coming back again. And so we've been doing this work to show what the snapshot of immunity looks like and to try and make the case for introduction of booster doses of vaccine. And in fact, that was taken up by the Telegraph last year, who agreed with our view that teenagers should get a booster dose of this vaccine. And in fact, in Canada, they've looked at this research and decided that they will introduce teenage booster doses in their programme, and it's currently being looked at in the UK as well. So I want to return now to the bit at the bottom here, which is the Group B. And this is a very important programme for us in that we're trying to develop a new vaccine which will deal with this last cause of meningitis in children in this country. And the reason why that's so important is the leading infectious cause of death in children now in the UK is this Group B meningococcus. And if we deal with that, there are then no other major infectious causes of death left in childhood, and we're just picking away at the edges for most other things. The problem with that is that this is that sugar capsule I mentioned that's around the outside. And this bug has been very, very clever, because what it's done is it's taken a sugar capsule, which is actually a sugar that you find on our brain cells while we're developing as a fetus. So our immune system has been taught not to recognise those sugars because it's part of our own body. And this bug's been incredibly clever in putting that around its surface. So you can't use it to make a vaccine, we just don't respond to it because we already see it as ourselves. And so we've had to move to the region underneath the capsule on the bug, which is called the outer membrane. And we've identified a couple of proteins which we believe will be very useful or very successful in a vaccine, and we have very good data now to suggest that that will be the case. And we've just been funded to take that forwards to trials probably in a year's time in adults to see if we're right. And what we've done is we've noticed that when these bacteria grow, and it's been known for a long time, they make little blebs of this outer membrane that they shed when they're growing. And here you can see from the surface some of these blebs being shed. And we can extract these blebs using a detergent, and this is what they look like after they've been extracted. And we've engineered some of the bacteria so that when they shed them, they contain a lot of these two proteins that we're interested in, and we're going to use those to make a vaccine. So what you're looking at is possibly the next important vaccine that could prevent meningitis in children in the UK, and that's what it would look like under the microscope. So that's a program that we're about to start manufacturing, and the manufacturing is actually we're going to do in Norway, which was the best value manufacturer we could find, and then the trials will be done back here in Oxford once we've got the vaccine prepared. The Independent came up with this headline after one of the trials we did a couple of years ago, "Meningitis defeated at last." It's actually a long way to go still to deal with this last type of meningitis, which has been so problematic. So to influenza. Now, pandemic influenza, I start off by talking about bird flu, because really in recent history, that's the bit that really raised our awareness of the risk of a pandemic, was because of the emergence of this H5N1 virus in Southeast Asia, causing some very severe disease in people who were closely associated with birds. Now, just to tell you a little bit about flu, there are three main types of virus. There's A, B and C, and most of the problem disease is caused by influenza A, and so that's most of the disease that we all suffer from every winter. And A can infect different species, but not all types of A can infect all types of species. In fact, the big problem are birds, avian species, for which almost all influenza viruses seem to be able to infect. And a lot of the generation of new viruses comes from birds. There's on the surface of influenza, there are different proteins, and two important ones are called H and N. And you might have heard H5N1, and that just tells you which type of H they have and which type of N on their surface. And so this is an influenza A virus with its H and N. So the seasonal flu vaccines that some of you in this room will have had this year contain three different viruses. They contain two A types and a B type, because most winters we have an outbreak of influenza A, and that's followed by an outbreak of influenza B. And the viruses that are put into the vaccine are chosen during the year before based on what's been circulating, and particularly what's been circulating in the southern hemisphere. And so this winter that we're in at the moment, there was an H3N2 virus in the vaccine, an H1N1 virus, but not the swine flu one, but one that had been circulating before, and a B virus. So that was the seasonal flu vaccine. And each year we have to make a new seasonal flu vaccine. And the reason for that is those H's and N's just change a little bit each year, so that when the virus circulates, our immune system doesn't respond quite as well as it might do to them, because the virus has changed a bit. And this is just showing that over years the H's and the N's change a little bit, and that's why we need to make a new flu vaccine every year. We still have a bit of immunity to last year's virus, which helps protect us a bit so we don't get terribly severe disease. But to really be protected, we need to have a new vaccine every year. In this country, somewhere between a few thousand and tens of thousands of people die from seasonal flu each year. And then when you look globally, it's somewhere around 300 to 500,000 deaths each year. So it's quite a common cause of death, mostly in older age groups. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop coughing now that you've brought it. So that's seasonal flu, which is a problem. It's there every year. The thing about pandemic flu is that there is a big change. So it's not the small changes year on year in the H and the N. It's completely new H and N. And that's because of mixing of the viruses or big changes. And in fact, if we look at the three major pandemics of the last 100 years, this one in 1918, which was Spanish flu, which was the proper pandemic where there were 50 million deaths. That in fact was a bird virus, which it just mutated a little bit. So instead of not being able to infect humans, it could infect humans extremely well and spread extremely well. So it was just a mutation in the virus that had been circulating in birds. And that's why in 2005, 2006, when bird flu was causing a problem in Southeast Asia, everyone was very worried, because this particular virus in 1918 just had a few mutations which made it absolutely lethal to human populations. And we already knew with the bird flu virus, the H5N1 virus in 2005, that if you could get disease with it, it was lethal. Half of the people who were infected died in 2005-06, around that time. The thing about it that was rubbish about that virus is it couldn't spread, which was good news for us, whereas the 1918 one was able to spread very readily, which is why it caused so many deaths. The next two pandemics here in the 1950s and 60s were caused by a mixture of viruses that came from birds and humans, and it's thought that they actually did their mixing in pigs. So a pig got an infection from a human and also got an infection from a bird, and then the virus got mixed up so that a new virus was formed, which had some of the bird segments in it, so it looked a bit like a bird virus, but it also had the transmissibility that made it good to cause infection in humans. And it spread reasonably well, caused a pandemic, but it didn't cause quite the number of deaths of the 1918 one. And there are lots of different reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into. And so when the H5N1 virus emerged in Southeast Asia during this decade, everyone was worried that either it would mix with some human viruses and become very good at transmitting and be lethal, or that it would mutate, as happened in 1918, and become lethal. But that didn't happen, or hasn't happened so far. But in a way, that bird flu virus remains the real threat, because it doesn't have to do very much. It doesn't have to mutate very much to become transmissible in human populations, and it's still out there at the moment, so that hasn't gone away. And we here were involved in trying to develop vaccines for the H5N1 virus so that we would be prepared if the disease did occur. And the trials were very important. The disease didn't come, so we haven't all been vaccinated, it hasn't been necessary, but the trials showed us how to make a pandemic vaccine. And all of the problems of dealing with a virus, most viruses, as you know, for flu or vaccines, are grown in eggs. And there are millions of eggs. I believe that for one dose of the vaccine, which many of you will have had, you need somewhere around 2 or 3 eggs to get enough of the virus out in order to make the vaccine. So you can imagine, with the millions and millions of doses that are given across the world each year, how many millions of eggs are being cultivated. And so one of the problems here was that the bird flu virus killed the eggs, and you couldn't actually grow it there. So they had to work out how to deal with that problem in order to be able to make a pandemic vaccine. So we learned a huge amount by going through the bird flu scenario. And we also learned a lot about how to make better responses. The seasonal vaccines don't work that well. You need to have a dose every year. And if you give them to children, you get very poor immune responses. And that may be one of the reasons why we're not very good at protecting children when new viruses appear. And so methods were developed for improving flu vaccines to give better protection for children, for children and adults. And the other thing was that we have very, very complex regulation, quite rightly, about licensure of vaccines. And in a pandemic, you need to be able to find a way through that allows you to not only develop but also regulate and license that vaccine to make sure it's safe before it's unleashed on the population. And so this process allowed a mock-up process of how a pandemic vaccine would be licensed. And that's all that then was put to good use when H1N1 came along. So this is the swine flu virus, and this is an actual picture of that virus there from CDC in Atlanta. And this virus was first seen in Mexico in March of last year, and the UK first case was about a month later, in April. And it's a mixture of viruses. There is some viruses which we know have been circulating in pigs in Europe for most of the last century. It also contains bits of viruses that have been circulated in North America for most of the last century, as well as some human components and some bird components. So it's a mixture of those different components. And it is an H1 and N1 virus. And one of the important things about that is that this particular type of virus hasn't really been around in the UK since about the late 1950s. But it was around, something similar to this, before 1957. And the reason why that's important is that if you were born before 1957, it's pretty likely you've already been exposed to a similar virus and won't have had much of a problem with flu this winter. Whereas all the rest of us who were born after 1957 had a bad winter and suffered with the vaccines. So where did it come from? And I think one of the things that we discovered, although we know that it has origins from pigs and birds and humans, we don't have any evidence that it was actually transmitted to us by pigs, which is the common perception. In fact, the only transmission between those species that's been well documented is where some pigs got this virus from humans who were suffering from it. And this was a farmer in Canada who developed swine flu and then transmitted it to his pigs. So it's actually the pigs that should be worried rather than us. And the thing that's most distressing about this report, sorry?
The farmer recovered.
The farmer recovered, yes. The pigs recovered, but I suspect actually the pigs were all killed, but that's another question. The most distressing thing about this report is that the farmer was called Mr. Pollard. and I didn't know I had any relatives in Canada. So when we knew this, that there was that the first wave of the pandemic had arrived, we knew that it was possible that in the second wave that there could be a much higher mortality and a much greater threat, and particularly to those born after 1957. And we know in previous pandemics that it's been children and young adults who are particularly affected during the pandemic. And so we decided that we needed to compare some of the available vaccines that were, and we worked with the Department of Health to try and provide some data in children. Because although there had been lots of work in adults on the H5N1 virus, and I talked about in the mock-up, and we really knew what to do with adults from that, there was relatively little information about children who were a particularly important target group if we'd had a lethal pandemic when it did come. So what about the future in the UK? there are actually a whole list of vaccines that are either already developed and used in some countries but not here, or nearing production, which could be introduced that could further defend the health of children and adults in this country. And I'm sure that one of the big challenges for this is to work out how to put some of these vaccines to improve health into that very crowded program that I mentioned before, without distressing parents more about numbers of needles. And of course we also have to be very careful. We know that when you put vaccines together, they can interfere with each other, so they don't work as well. And so we need to study this very, very carefully as we try and make these changes to the program. Now, in 2009, the lives of 2 million children in the world were saved by vaccines. There's probably at least another million who died just because they didn't get access to vaccines that we've had for most of the last century. And I think that's the tragic thing about immunisation. It isn't all the excitement of new vaccines we've developed, but that so many children in the world are suffering from diseases that we haven't even seen in this country. The things that parents here are worrying about, whether the vaccine should be used, in other countries children are dying from those diseases because they have no access to those vaccines.